Hi, good afternoon. Can everyone hear me at the back? Can I get a thumbs up? Brilliant. So I'm really excited to be here today to speak to you all. This is the first in-person event I've done since the beginning of the pandemic, so it's really great to be speaking face-to-face. Today I'm going to be talking about the sort of post-COP political landscape in the UK, and my talk is entitled, Without COP, What Hope Is There for Domestic Action? For the UK environment sector, COP26 has been both a gift and a challenge. So in terms of being a gift, for the past 2 years, the UK government has been on a global stage in front of the world and has had its environmental and climate credibility really tested to the max. And this has been helpful for us as a leveraging point. We've been able to push the government for greater ambition and greater action. And it's also been useful for exposing areas of climate of policy inconsistency. So, for example, funding overseas fossil fuel projects through UK export finance, or giving the green light to the first deep coal mine in Cumbria for 30 years. But now that COP26 has concluded, we have a significant challenge because we've lost this really good leveraging tool, and we have to look for new ways to push the government on climate and nature also. One of the big outcomes of COP26 is that governments upgraded their national determined contributions, NDCs, which are their 2030 targets, and they agreed that they would come back at COP27, which will be at Egypt, and upgrade them again. And that's a really significant outcome and keeps 1.5 just within touching distance. But to be frank, climate targets don't mean anything unless they're implemented and unless there's meaningful action behind them to actually make progress. And this is where the UK comes in, because we're currently COP presidents and we can show the world it's possible to make meaningful progress, and we can only do that through domestic delivery on our climate targets. So for the UK environment sector, this is the really critical next step. So in my talk, and I probably have 17 minutes and I'll try and keep to my 20 minutes as close as possible, I'm hoping to leave you with a better understanding of three things. The first is where the UK currently is on climate action. The second are some of the barriers to domestic delivery. And the third are some opportunities to push the government further and some sort of key actors that exist outside of Westminster. So first of all, the UK is genuinely a world leader when it comes to ambition. We were the first major economy to set a legally binding net zero target in 2050, which was passed unanimously by Parliament, which is really quite unique. And we also have lots of bold and ambitious interim targets also. So we have our NDC, which I mentioned earlier, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 68% by 2030. We have a target to reduce emissions by 78% by 2035. And we also have 5 yearly carbon budgets, which the government has to meet. And on top of all of that, we now have sector-specific decarbonisation strategies in transport, industry, buildings, which you guessed it, have more ambitions and more targets to meet. So in terms of the ambition, it's currently there, but the important bit now is actually meeting our targets and really implementing them. And historically, the UK government has been quite good at doing this. So between 1990 and 2017, the UK reduced its emissions by 42% whilst growing the economy by 72%. And this is largely thanks to the phase out of coal-powered energy, which is one of the dirtiest fossil fuels. But decarbonisation beyond that, and phasing out coal was a bit of a low-hanging fruit because most people won't notice if their homes are now being powered by less polluting fossil fuels or even better renewable energy. But decarbonisation beyond that is trickier and more politically sensitive because it really is more intimate in that it sort of involves the public a lot more. It sort of influences and changes the ways we live, the way we travel, how we consume and eat and so forth. And something I work at, sorry, I haven't mentioned the fact that I'm a policy advisor at Green Alliance, which is an independent charity and think tank, and we focus on ambitious leadership on climate and nature. And something I work on at Green Alliance is our net zero policy tracker, which tracks policies and spending the government announces, and we basically see what progress that makes against our net zero targets. And in our latest update, which was published in September, we calculated that policies announced since the start of 2020, so essentially the new government, have only got us a quarter of the way to meeting our fifth carbon budget target, which is 2028 to 2032. So as you can see, there's a significant gap now between ambition and domestic delivery on climate. That needs to be plugged, and there are also significant challenges to domestic delivery. The first of which exists within government, within the Treasury specifically, and with Rishi Sunak. So what we've observed over the past 2 years is consistent resistance within the Treasury on the net zero agenda. They've abandoned key decarbonisation projects like the Green Homes Grant, which was a $3 billion post-COVID flagship project to retrofit homes. And that was abandoned because of design issues, but the money was never put back into another retrofitting program. Yesterday, if you you might have noticed the government published its integrated rail plan, which axed the eastern leg of HS2 and the northern powerhouse rail. Internal briefings suggest it was the Treasury who's trying to cut back on spending, essentially. And that's quite a shame, because public transport is a major part of decarbonising the transport sector. And last month, the Treasury also published its comprehensive spending review, which sets out government spending over the next 3 years. And some analysis we did showed that the Treasury only commits 20.9 billion for green spending over the next 3 years. And whilst that might sound a lot, that's only 7 billion a year. We calculate that we need, on top of that, another 18 billion a year. And it just really falls short of the scale of the challenge. And in his speech, also, Rishi Sunak only mentioned net zero 3 times and climate change once. But on his bit about reforming alcohol duty, he mentioned cider 12 times and wine 10 times. So on a sort of rhetoric level, the Treasury is behind other departments. You might be wondering why the Treasury is sort of putting the brakes on the net zero agenda, and there are a couple of reasons. One is ideological, so Rishi Sunak is a fiscally conservative Thatcherite chancellor. Another is political, so what we've heard is that Rishi Sunak is reticent to speak out on green issues because he sees it as a potential reputational risk, and also that he doesn't want to tread on the PM's toes because the net zero agenda is very much the PM's territory. There's another reason, which is with the Treasury itself on a sort of structural level, it tends to have a bit of static view of the future of the economy and focuses on costs rather than opportunities. There has been a bit of development recently, so the Treasury published its net zero review, which is an analytical document which looks at the cost of net zero, and at its core it accepts the fact that the cost of inaction greatly outweighs the cost of climate policies, which is positive to hear. And so the Treasury is really blocking progress, and it's really key to get the Treasury on side because for climate policies to work, they need to have the appropriate public funding behind them and backing and support from the Treasury. The second barrier to delivery also exists within Westminster, but rather than in government, is within Parliament. So we've noticed a growing number of Conservative backbenchers who are essentially climate denialists in another form. So rather than question the climate science, which they know will get them laughed out of Parliament because there's consensus behind it, they instead sort of question the method of transitioning to a net zero economy. Some of these MPs include Craig McKinley, who's at the bottom of the screen. He's the chairman of the so-called Net Zero Scrutiny Group. And also Steve Baker, who's in the top right, and he's a trustee for the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which is one of the UK's leading climate denialist groups and recently branded to something called the Net Zero Watch. And these group of MPs use sort of a common number of tactics to really try and slow the pace of decarbonisation. So they cite reasons such as China. So China is the largest emitter. What difference does it make what the UK does? They try and latch on to current economic issues. So currently there's a cost of living crisis with inflation. The Treasury is trying to claw back money from COVID and things like universal credit's been scrapped. So they've been trying to latch onto that and saying that net zero is unaffordable and it hit low-income households the most. And these are all essentially culture war tactics, and that's really the danger. So it's important to say that these groups of MPs is very much a fringe view at the moment, but as we saw with Brexit, fringe views can become mainstream quite quickly. So whilst not being a sort of blocker of delivery yet, we need to watch them quite closely and ensure, like, I think really the danger is that they try and polarize climate change and make it a culture war topic. So those are sort of two of the biggest barriers to domestic delivery. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that it's all doom and gloom, that we should retreat into our bunkers and just give up, because that's very much not the case. And I also don't want to leave you with the impression that change only happens within Westminster, because there are key change makers that exist outside. So there are devolved authorities, the private sector, and the public, all of which have a significant role to play in pushing the government on ambition and delivery. And I'm going to talk through each of these in turn. So the first are devolved authorities, and these include the Northern Irish, Welsh, and Scottish assemblies. But what I'm most interested in are metro mayors, and these are local leaders of city regions in England. So there are 9, and they represent roughly 1/5 of the population of England. And they have, the ones you might have heard of are Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester, Andy Street in the West Midlands, Tracy Brabin in Yorkshire. And these metro mayors have powers and budgets over transport, planning, and local economic growth. And that maps very neatly onto the government's net zero agenda, because transport and housing are 2 of the largest emitting sectors in the UK of greenhouse gases. So they have a significant role to play in decarbonising the city regions. And they also have soft powers which will enable them to do it. So they have good relationships with local businesses. They have close relationships and good reputations with civil society and a local mandate from the public. And I think one of the most compelling reasons for metro mayors is that really city regions are sort of test beds for climate solutions. So in Teesside, it's the first city region to have a industrial hydrogen cluster. In the West Midlands, they're trialling mobility credit schemes in Coventry, which are essentially where you trade in your old polluting diesel or petrol car, and they give you £3,000 worth of mobility credits, which can be used on public transport or car sharing schemes and stuff like that. And if these are proved successful, you can then scale them up onto a national level, which I think is a very compelling reason for metro mayors and for domestic delivery. Currently, metro mayors are slightly stifled by the fact that there's no sort of formal expectations or roles for them within the sort of wider national effort. So what we need going forward is sort of a mutually agreed framework between local leaders and central government, which sets out their expectations and their roles, and also long-term funding streams, which will enable them to actually deliver and implement climate policies. The other change maker is the private sector. So the CCC, which is the government's independent advisory body, stands for Climate Change Committee, estimate that the bulk of the net zero transition will be funded by the private sector. And that's because whilst governments have billions, the private sector has trillions. So businesses play a really important role in domestic action. And one of the big differences we saw from COP26 compared to COP21, which was the Paris Climate Summit, is that in Paris, governments were pushing businesses. And for the first time, COP26, we saw businesses pushing governments. And we saw that even before the conference. So there was this really good campaign called Race to Zero, which aimed to sign up cities, regions, institutions, and businesses up to net zero targets. And by the end of the campaign, they managed to sign up 25% of the world's emissions and 50% of the world's GDP up to net zero targets, which is a real achievement. And there were lots of side deals as well at Glasgow, which involved businesses, and one that I'll mention is the Glasgow Declaration on Zero Emission Cars and Vans, which was essentially a commitment to phase out new diesel and petrol cars by a certain date. It was signed internationally by countries like Rwanda, Luxembourg, and the UK, but significantly, it was signed by car makers like Ford, Volvo, and GM, so major car-making companies, and also by Uber, which I think is just a good example of how things are changing. And the final change maker who can really deliver is the public. So this government really values the court of public opinion, and you can see that by how many U-turns they make on policies which they realise are sort of publicly unfavourable. So the public have an important role to play in, one, demonstrating that there's a mandate for climate action, and for two, for creating or injecting a sense of political jeopardy into Westminster. And what I mean by this is that departments and ministers and even MPs who are slacking could potentially lose votes over not acting and not delivering. And that's really an important part for the public to play. So I'm aware that some of this has been a bit doom and gloom. We've talked about how far off track the UK is and some of the big barriers, but I thought I'd leave you with something a bit more upbeat. So I've been tracking the sort of state of public opinion over the past 2 years, and two polls I just want to show you are, one, so on the left, it's a poll asking, but it's by SEC Newsgate, and it asks members of the public what issues of greatest concern. And as you can see on the left, climate change is the issue of greatest concern, above COVID and the economy. And this is quite significant because it's been basically trailing since the beginning of the pandemic. So there is sort of widespread mandate for action. And the poll on the right by Opinium asks the public which they are concerned more about. Are they concerned more about the cost of climate policies, which is on the left in black, or are they concerned about the lack of action, which is on in the middle in green? And as you can see, 55% of the public essentially fear the cost of inaction more than the cost of climate policies. And this is because they recognize that climate policies are a means of securing a more prosperous future for future generations. And also because the public, you can see the damages of climate change already, which the public recognizes. And I think that's just like a really positive thing to hold on to, but it's also important we don't take it for granted, but we can use that as a sort of significant leveraging tool for pushing the government on ambition and delivery. So to summarize before I open up to the floor and take questions, the conclusion of COP26 leaves a vacuum and a significant dilemma for how the UK environment sector will push the government to increase its ambition and its implementation of climate policies. In this post-COP landscape, there are barriers within government in sort of slacking departments, particularly Treasury, and within Parliament with the sort of net zero skeptic MPs, which I mentioned. But there are also opportunities, for example, the private sector, the public, and devolved local leaders, all of which have a really important part to play in implementing and delivering on climate. So to answer the question I set out originally, yes, I do believe there's hope for domestic action post or without COP. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to open the floor and take questions.
Thank you very much. Absolutely fantastic talk. Really clear, very punchy, and it's. I hope you'll agree. Quite often when I go to talks like this, you can come away feeling unbelievably pessimistic about almost everything. And it's really nice to see some things recognising the challenges, but also the opportunities if we take advantage of them. So thank you very much, James. Got time for a few questions. Is there anybody who'd like to have a go? Yes.
I'd like to ask a general question about Green Alliance. How much of your work is directed at pushing the government and local authorities and so on? How much is working with other environmental groups? And I've always thought of the Green Alliance as somehow should be something that's linking everything. Is it?
Yeah, okay, so Green Alliance, we work, so a non-partisan group, we work cross-party, and we're quite inside track focused. So we have lots of meetings with civil servants, MPs, ministers, and we develop policies in-house and advocate them to the government. And we also stage interventions through publications, Prime Minister's questions, PQs, and lots of other methods. And on your point on how we interact with other environmental NGOs and the sort of wider environment sector, the sort of, I think, USP of Green Alliance is that we're very much a convener of other groups. So we sort of hold lots of act as a secretariat for lots of other NGOs, and we sort of hold spaces for us to talk and discuss sort of our policy priorities and what sort of political avenues we'll go down. So yes, we work sort of directly with parties and politicians, and we also play sort of a role as a convener of the wider environment group.
Yes.
You mentioned that there might be a vacuum post-COP. Do you feel that some of the things that were discussed at COP, such as the green financing and also the mandatory disclosures that could be facing the largest companies in the UK, they might start filtering down and thus might still make progress without actually coming from governmental policy?
Yeah, so there were lots of sort of positive things on green finance announced at COP, and I'm sure they will trickle down. But my concern really is that we still need the Treasury to push for them. And I think COP26 has really lit the fire underneath Treasury to act. And what I'm concerned about really is that now that COP26 is finished, but we're still COP presidents, that the Treasury is not going to really act on that. I think the Treasury's main approach is crowding in private finance for the net zero transition through regulation, but even on that, it's quite weak. So yeah, I'm sure we'll see some of the positive elements trickle through, but I think we need to see lots more from Treasury and Rishi Sunak and more involvement on that going through this year towards COP27.
Thank you. Yeah.
You were talking about the Treasury, but what about the Department of Environment itself and George Eustace? Do you have active links and positive links with him? Because I worry about him a bit.
Yes, so we work closely with DEFRA a lot, and we, I think Green Alliance recently organised a 7 NGO meeting, so a CEO meeting of 7 major UK environmental groups with George Eustace, and we have sort of more positive relationships with him now. I think George Eustace really represents the sort of the farming sector, which has been challenging at some times, and we've been pushing quite hard on things like the environmental land management scheme, which is the flagship post-Brexit sort of farming thing, and sort of replaces the common agricultural practice of the EU. So we've been working quite closely with them on that. So yeah, good relationships really.
Because it looked as if the outcome post-Brexit for the farmers was looking very, very rocky, and I don't know if it still is. I mean, they say they're going to get less and so, but it worries me a lot.
Yeah, this agriculture and land use isn't a topic I work across massively, but I think there are sort of negatives and positives of the environmental land management scheme, but at its core is the public money for public goods aspect, which will public money for public goods, which is kind of the cornerstone of the ELM's environmental land management, where it sort of pays farmers to do things that are good for soil health, so reducing pesticides, planting trees, which is for carbon sequestration, and stuff like that.
Maybe time for one more. Yes.
I'm quite interested in the scale of the metro management you called it, and just the city generally. You mentioned that they're quite good test beds for scaling up projects. For that to happen, do you think there would have to be an ideological change within central government themselves? I don't know whether if there are successful examples of those happening within metro regions, city regions, whether that would be scaled up, whether that would be influenced by who sits in power, and as you said, the ideology of the Treasury and so forth.
Yeah, I think that there needs to be a bit of a step change. So a bit of background on metro mayors. They were introduced during the the coalition government the coalition government by George Osborne. It was sort of his brainchild. But this particular government is more keen on centralisation. And what we were expecting this year was a devolution white paper, which never came out and I think has actually been scrapped. But that would have been a really important would have been a really sort of important document for setting out government's relationship with devolved authorities. So I agree that does need to be a change in mindset within government to really empower devolved leaders and county councils to really push further on ambition and delivery.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. Maybe one more little round of applause.
Thanks so much.
So, Raj, I think that's it. Yeah, from here, from nowhere.